My name is Lauren Vance, and I'm 28 years old. 10 years ago, my father sat at our mahogany dining table, looked directly at my college acceptance letter, and slid it into the shredder while my mother poured tea. He told me that girls don't need degrees, that my brother's business acumen was the family's future, and that they wouldn't give me a single dollar for university fees. They cut me off completely when I packed my bags anyway, refusing to take my calls, skipping my graduation, and acting as if I had vanished from the family tree. But yesterday morning, the doors to the regional development boardroom swung open, and when my father and brother walked in to pitch for the massive economic survival grant that could save their failing manufacturing plant, they found me sitting at the head of the committee. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are listening from right now. Now, let me take you back to the summer of 2016, to a humid evening in Savannah, Georgia, and the last time I ever asked my parents for a future. Growing up, the Vance household ran on a very strict traditional blueprint. My father, Arthur Vance, operated Vance Manufacturing, a mid-sized assembly plant that produced custom metal components for regional builders. He was a man built like a brick wall, with a booming voice and a complete obsession with legacy. My mother, Alina, was the quiet enabler, a woman who spent her life managing the household accounts, smoothing over my father's temper, and reinforcing his rigid worldview. Then there was my brother, Bradley. Bradley was 2 years older than me, a charismatic, loud-talking high school sports star who could charm my father with a single joke about logistics or football. In my father's eyes, Bradley was the crown prince. He was the one destined to inherit the office, the title, and the glory of the Vance name. I was the quiet architecture. While Bradley was downstairs holding court with my father's business associates, I was upstairs in my room, analyzing economic trend reports, reading corporate law case studies, and mapping out structural data profiles. I didn't cause trouble. I didn't break rules. I simply wasn't factored into the long-term balance sheet. There is a profound difference between being a daughter who is loved and a daughter who is viewed as a liability. Here is a small example from when I was 16. I had entered a regional youth entrepreneurship competition, spending 3 months building a comprehensive 50-page business model for automated inventory tracking. I won first place, receiving a glass plaque and a small commendation letter. The same weekend, Bradley had a regional exhibition match. My parents, of course, drove 3 hours to watch him sit on the bench. When I showed my father the plaque on Sunday evening, he glanced at it, set his coffee mug down on top of the glass surface, and said, "That's nice, Lauren, but real business isn't done on paper. Go help your mother with the laundry." He never asked what my model was about. He never asked why the judges had praised it. I told myself it didn't hurt. I told myself that validation didn't need to come from a man who measured worth entirely by testosterone and traditional obedience. I poured everything into my education, maintaining a perfect 4 GPA, taking every advanced placement course available, and studying for the SATs until my eyes burned in the midnight dark. I figured if I couldn't be the child they noticed, I would become the powerhouse they couldn't ignore. And for one brief, shining moment, I thought I had succeeded. The acceptance letter from the Wharton School of Business arrived on a crisp Tuesday in April. It was a massive achievement, an elite program, a direct launchpad into corporate governance and financial strategy. When I showed the letter at dinner, my mother paused her fork midair. My father took the paper, read the header, and his face didn't soften. It tightened. "Wharton," he said slowly, like he was assessing a bad shipment of steel. "That's expensive, and it's 4 years in Philadelphia." "I can get student loans for part of it," I said, my voice eager, desperate for him to see the vision. "But I need your signature for the institutional fee gap. It's a guaranteed return, Dad. I'll come back and revolutionize the company's financial structure." Bradley laughed from across the table. It wasn't an aggressive laugh. It was that casual, dismissive chuckle he'd learned from our father. "Lauren, you're going to spend $250,000 to learn how to tell me how to run my company. Girls don't need degrees to marry well anyway." My father didn't reprimand him. Instead, he stood up, walked over to the home office shredder near the sideboard, and slid my acceptance letter directly into the blades. The mechanical hum filled the dining room as the paper turned into white confetti. "Vance Manufacturing goes to Bradley," my father said, adjusting his cuffs. "Every dollar of our family savings is tied up in expanding the main assembly line for his transition next year. We don't have money to waste on an Ivy League credential for a girl who will change her last name in 10 years anyway. If you want to take secretarial courses at the local community college, we'll talk. Otherwise, you're on your own." My mother didn't say a word. She just reached over, adjusted the salt shaker, and whispered, "Eat your chicken, Lauren. Your father knows best." I sat there, 3,000 miles from my dream, looking at the shredded remains of my hard work, and realized that my family hadn't just denied me a college fund. They had erased my identity. The next morning, I packed 2 suitcases with everything I owned. I didn't ask for a ride. I called a local taxi, rode down to the Greyhound station, and left Savannah with exactly $412 in my checking account and a fire in my chest that no amount of rejection could extinguish. I tried to maintain contact during my first semester. I called my mother 14 times in 3 weeks. The first few went to voicemail. By the 4th week, my father had instructed the family provider to block my number entirely. When I emailed my father a PDF of my first semester dean's list commendation, along with a formal request to discuss a bridge loan, the email bounced back with a system notification. "Recipient has blocked your address." They didn't just refuse to pay. They decided that a daughter who defied their traditional mandate was a daughter who no longer existed. I survived because of my grandmother, Evelyn Vance. Evelyn was my father's mother, a fierce, sharp-witted woman who had been living quietly in a small cottage near Brunswick after my grandfather passed away. She was the only Vance who had ever looked at my business diagrams with genuine interest. When she found out what my father had done with the acceptance letter, she didn't yell. She called her estate attorney, rearranged her private assets, and bypassed my father entirely. "Arthur is a fool who confuses control with capability," she told me over the phone during my second winter in Philadelphia. She had sent a cashier's check directly to the Wharton bursar's office, covering my tuition gap for the year. "He thinks he's building a fortress, but he's just building a cage. You get that degree, Lauren. You become the architect, and don't you dare let men who only know how to melt metal tell you how to shape the world." She died during my junior year. Because my father had assumed she was entirely on his side, he didn't realize she had left her modest personal investments and her Brunswick property entirely to me, placed securely inside an independent educational trust that my brother and parents couldn't touch. When I attended her funeral, my father stood on the opposite side of the grave. He looked at me, dressed in my university blazer, and didn't cross the grass to hug me. He just nodded once, cold and distant, as if I were a distant competitor who had shown up to survey the land. I graduated summa cum laude. No one from Savannah came. While other students were taking photos with their parents under the campus oaks, I stood alone with my diploma, looked at the gold seal, and made a promise to the memory of Evelyn Vance. I was going to build a life so structurally sound that no one would ever be able to shred my foundation again. Over the next 6 years, I climbed like a woman running out of time. I took a position at a major state economic development authority, specializing in industrial revitalization grants and corporate restructuring. I learned how municipal funds worked, how state commerce committees distributed capital, and how multi-million-dollar business grants were audited. I didn't look back at Savannah. I didn't check their social media. But I always kept my ears open to the regional manufacturing network. By 2024, the economic landscape began to shift dramatically. Supply chains tightened, raw material costs skyrocketed, and mid-sized plants that hadn't modernized their technology began to bleed capital. Vance Manufacturing was one of them. Bradley had taken over operational leadership, and from what I heard through state trade journals, his business acumen consisted of buying luxury company vehicles, ignoring automated inventory systems, and relying on old regional relationships that were rapidly evaporating. They were drowning in debt, relying on an archaic facility that was costing them double the regional average in waste. Then, 3 months ago, the governor announced the State Industrial Synergy Grant, a massive $15 million economic injection fund designed to save critical regional employers who were on the verge of bankruptcy, provided they could present a flawless, high-tech restructuring plan. It was a lifeline for dying businesses. And last month, the State Commerce Board appointed me as the chairwoman of the Regional Selection Committee. Yesterday morning, January present day, I woke up at 5:00 a.m. I am 28 years old. I live in a beautiful high-rise apartment overlooking the Capitol. My suits are tailored, my credentials are clear, and my name sits on a bronze plate outside the main committee chamber. I walked into the boardroom at 8:30 a.m., my files neatly arranged on the long walnut table. My committee members, 5 senior economic analysts and 2 state senators, took their seats around me. According to the morning log, the first presentation of the day was Application 42, Vance Manufacturing, represented by Arthur Vance and Bradley Vance. I leaned back in my leather chair, adjusted the microphone at my lapel, and waited for the double doors to open. Before we move into the boardroom, I have a question for you. If you were in my position, sitting at that table with the power to decide the survival of the family that disowned you, what would you do? Option A, would you recuse yourself to remain entirely neutral? Option B, would you reject them instantly as poetic justice? Or option C, would you make them pitch their case by the absolute letter of the law, knowing exactly where their flaws are hidden? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I read every single one. And if you think my father is about to regret every word he said at that dining table, type karma asterisk. Let's keep going, because what happened when those doors opened is something none of them saw coming. The boardroom doors cracked open at exactly 9:00 a.m. My father walked in first, wearing his best charcoal suit, the one he wore to bank meetings, and carrying a leather presentation folder. He had that familiar, aggressive posture, the look of a man who assumed he was the most important person in any room he entered. Bradley followed right behind him, looking slightly softer, a gold watch gleaming on his wrist, adjusting his tie with a confident smile. They were laughing quietly as they approached the presenter's podium, completely certain that their name and regional history would guarantee them the $3 million allocation. They didn't look at the committee faces immediately. My father was busy setting up his printed charts, and Bradley was adjusting the digital projector. "Good morning, members of the committee," my father began, his voice booming with that old boardroom authority. "I'm Arthur Vance, founder of Vance Manufacturing, and this is our chief executive, Bradley Vance. We are here today to request a structural stabilization grant of $3 million to preserve a cornerstone of our local economy. Please state your corporate registration number for the record," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, clinical, and smooth. My father paused. The sound of my voice made his shoulders stiffen. He slowly raised his eyes from his folder, tracking past the state senators, past the financial analysts, until his gaze landed directly on me. The recognition didn't hit him all at once. It moved through him like an electric shock. His eyebrows went up, his jaw slackened slightly, and his hands, which were resting on the edges of the podium, went completely still. Bradley looked up a half-second later, his confident smile freezing mid-face until it looked like a cracked mask. "Lauren," Bradley whispered, his voice cracking slightly under the acoustic microphones. Behind me, the committee secretary tapped her pen on her clipboard. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a single sign of familial warmth. I looked at them through my reading glasses with the exact same objective clarity I used for every struggling corporate applicant. "In this chamber, I am Chairwoman Vance," I said, the words cutting through the microphone with absolute precision. "Mr. Vance, please proceed with your operational overview. You have exactly 10 minutes. Through the glass partition behind them, I could see my mother sitting in the public waiting area, holding her purse tightly against her knees. She had looked through the window, recognized the profile of the woman in the custom tailoring at the head of the table, and pressed her hand against her mouth. 10 years of blocked calls, shredded dreams, and complete silence were standing in that room, under the cold fluorescent lights. And for the first time in his life, my father had absolutely nothing to decree. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. You could hear the faint, rhythmic whir of the digital projector cooling fan, a sharp contrast to the suffocating stillness that had gripped my father and brother. Bradley stood with his mouth slightly open, his hand still frozen on his necktie. My father's fingers clutched the edges of the walnut podium so tightly that his knuckles turned a bloodless, paper white. He was a man who had spent 40 years giving orders from the head of a table, a man who believed that his authority was a natural law. Now, he was standing at a presenter's podium, looking up at the daughter he had erased, waiting for permission to speak. "Chairwoman Vance," my father stammered, the words rough and uneven, completely stripped of the booming confidence he had entered with. He cleared his throat, trying to force his old corporate posture back into his spine. We did not realize you were heading this committee." "The committee membership has been public record for 3 months, Mr. Vance," I replied. My voice through the microphone was cool, measured, and entirely clear. I did not lean forward. I did not show anger. I simply sat with the unyielding posture of a woman who had built her own foundation. "We review applications based purely on operational integrity and structural data profiles. Your background material has been processed under application 42. You are wasting your presentation window. Please begin your pitch." Bradley leaned toward my father, whispering frantically, but the highly sensitive directional microphones at the podium caught every single syllable. "Dad, what do we do? She's going to tank us. She's going to reject the grant out of spite." I didn't break eye contact with my brother. "Bradley Vance, if you speak out of turn again, I will have the sergeant-at-arms escort you from the chamber for disrupting a formal state hearing. Your company is facing a critical debt threshold. I suggest you focus on your metrics." Senator Harrison, sitting to my left, adjusted his glasses and looked at me, then down at the Vance Manufacturing file. He knew the regional history, but in this room, state protocol was absolute. "Please proceed, gentlemen," the senator said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The clock is running." My father adjusted his papers with trembling fingers. For the next 8 minutes, the presentation was a complete masterclass in structural failure. My father read from the slides, but his eyes kept darting back to me, looking for a flinch, a smirk, a sign of the 17-year-old girl who used to look up at him from the foot of the dinner table. He didn't find her. He found a Wall Street-trained financial strategist who was tracking every single contradiction in their balance sheet. When my father finished reading the summary, Bradley stepped up to handle the operational details. He attempted to use the same old-school charm that had worked on regional banks for a decade. He talked about legacy, about the Vance way, about the spirit of Southern manufacturing. He used broad, sweeping phrases, completely ignoring the specific technological metrics required by the Synergy Fund. "We are a family business," Bradley said, throwing his shoulders back, trying to regain his footing. "We rely on deep regional relationships. This $3 million grant will allow us to maintain our current workforce and bridge the gap until the market stabilizes." He clicked to the final slide and smiled, a desperate, sweating version of the smile he had worn at my acceptance dinner. "Thank you for your time. We welcome your questions." I opened the leather portfolio in front of me. Inside were 50 pages of independent audit reports, technology benchmarks, and raw financial tracking data for Vance Manufacturing. Data I had spent the last 3 weeks analyzing line by line. I didn't need to read them. I had memorized their failures the way I used to memorize biology textbooks at Thanksgiving. "Thank you for the overview," I said, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "Let's look at the actual metrics. On page 14 of your proposal, you state that your primary operational drain is rising raw material costs. However, according to the State Industrial Registry, your facility's material waste allocation is currently running at 24%. The regional average for an automated assembly line is 4%. Why hasn't Vance Manufacturing updated its automated tracking arrays in the last 8 years?" Bradley blinked, a bead of sweat tracing a line down his temple. We have looked into automation, Chairwoman, but we believe in the human element. Our workers handle inventory manually. It's a tradition of craftsmanship." "It's not craftsmanship, Mr. Vance. It's an administrative deficit," I replied, my voice completely flat. Your manual tracking has resulted in 3 separate supply chain bottlenecks this fiscal year alone, costing your vendors $200,000 in delivery penalties. Let's move to your executive balance sheet. I flipped a single page in my folder. The clink of the paper against the walnut table sounded like a gavel. In June of 2024, while your plant was laying off 14 line workers due to capital constraints, Vance Manufacturing approved an executive compensation bonus of $95,000 for Bradley Vance, along with the lease of a custom luxury SUV under corporate overhead. Can you explain how a state-funded stabilization grant aligns with a luxury vehicle allocation for an executive who is currently missing 80% of his technology targets? My father stepped forward, his old reflex kicking in, his face turning a dark, dangerous crimson. He slammed his palm onto the presenter's podium. Now see here, Lauren, that vehicle is for client relations. You have no right to stand up there and lecture us about how we run our family business. We built that plant while you were. The microphone cut off instantly. I had pressed the master mute button under my right hand. The boardroom went dead quiet. My father was still moving his mouth, his chest heaving, his face contorted in anger, but no sound was coming out of the speakers. He looked at the microphone, then at me, realizing in real time that his voice in this building only existed if I allowed it. I waited exactly 5 seconds, letting the weight of his silenced rage settle over the committee members. Then, I released the button. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dropping into a register so quiet that the entire room had to strain to hear it. "This committee does not negotiate with volume. You are in a state chamber, requesting public capital funded by taxpayers. Your legacy does not exempt you from accountability, and your temper does not alter your debt ratio. If you raise your voice or slam a surface in this room again, I will vote to disqualify application 42 immediately for noncompliance with decorum. Do you understand me?" My father stood frozen. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had slid my Wharton acceptance letter into the shredder while my mother poured tea. Slowly, painfully, he lifted his hand off the podium and stepped back. He nodded once, a small, devastated movement of his chin. "Yes," he whispered. "Understood." "Good," I said, adjusting my reading glasses. "Let's talk about your liquidity ratio." For the next 20 minutes, I didn't yell. I didn't mention the text messages they had blocked. I didn't mention the emails they had bounced back, or the graduation they had skipped. I simply recited the facts. I laid out their debts, their archaic logistics, their failed oversight, and their complete refusal to modernize. I took their business apart piece by piece, layer by layer, using the exact legal and economic precision I had learned at the university they refused to fund. The committee members were writing furiously. Senator Harrison was shaking his head as the data exposed the depth of Bradley's mismanagement. My brother looked like a man who had been surgically removed from his own illusion. Every metric he had tried to hide, every luxury lease he had tucked under corporate overhead, was sitting on a public record, illuminated by a projector screen. When I finished the cross-examination, I closed my folder cleanly. "The committee will recess for executive deliberation," I announced, looking directly at the podium. "A formal determination on application #042 will be delivered in 45 minutes. You may wait in the gallery." My father didn't move for 3 seconds. Then, he slowly gathered his printed charts, his hands shaking so violently that a page slipped out and drifted onto the carpet. Bradley didn't help him pick it up. He turned and pushed through the double doors, leaving my father to gather his ruined legacy alone under the lights. I watched through the glass partition as they exited into the main hallway. My mother stood up immediately from the vinyl bench, her eyes swollen, reaching for my father's arm. He didn't look at her. He kept walking down the corridor, his head down, his shoulders hunched forward, looking exactly his age for the first time in my life. I stood up from my leather chair and walked into the private committee anteroom. The room was small, quiet, and lined with portraits of past commerce chairs. I stood by the window, looking out over the city streets where the morning traffic was moving in neat, automated patterns. My hands were perfectly steady. The adrenaline that had carried me through the presentation began to cool, leaving a profound, structural clarity in its wake. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't broken a single state regulation. I had simply held up a mirror made of numbers, and my family had broken against their own reflection. Before I go out there to deliver the committee's final verdict, I want to ask you one more thing. Do you think a family business that refuses to adapt, that relies on entitlement instead of capability, deserves to be saved by public funds? Or is the most human choice to let the structures that are built on control crumble so that something honest can start? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because the final chapter of this selection committee is about to close. Deliberation took exactly 30 minutes. When the bells rang to reconvene the session, the gallery was packed with regional reporters, industrial donors, and other corporate applicants. My parents and brother took their seats in the front row of the public benches, sitting rigid, looking at the empty podium. I walked back into the chamber, my spine straight, my heels making a sharp, steady rhythm against the marble floor. I took my seat at the head of the table, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the faces waiting for the decree. Regarding application 42, I began, my voice carrying to every corner of the crowded room. The Regional Selection Committee has reached a verdict. The hum of the microphone set up amplified the heavy silence in the room as I looked down at the official state ledger in front of me. 200 people in the gallery held their breath. In the front row, Arthur Vance sat with his arms locked tightly across his chest, staring at the floorboards, while Alina clutched a tissue so tightly in her lap it had begun to shred into white fibers between her fingers. Bradley was slouched, his eyes wide and vacant, staring directly at the gold seal emblazoned on the wall behind my head. The mandate of the State Industrial Synergy Grant, I began, my voice cool, resonant, and entirely steady, is to allocate public funds exclusively to corporate structures that demonstrate absolute financial discipline, technological viability, and sustainable growth. It is not an inheritance stabilization fund. It is not a liquidation bridge for companies that refuse to modernize. I turned a single page in my ledger. The crisp snap of the heavy paper cut through the room like a physical blow. Upon a unanimous vote of the selection committee, application 42 for Vance Manufacturing is officially denied. Bradley's head snapped up. A muffled gasp rippled through the back rows of the gallery, where several regional builders and metal suppliers were sitting. My mother covered her face with both hands, her shoulders sinking forward. My father didn't flinch. He just closed his eyes, a deep, slow expiration leaving his chest as the finality of the words settled into the room. $3 million in public capital had just vanished from their balance sheet, and with it, the final structural pillar holding up their debt-ridden operation. However, I continued, pausing to let the weight of the rejection clear the air, the committee recognizes the vital role that the underlying manufacturing assets and line workers play in our regional economy. Therefore, the committee has approved a conditional structural restructuring directive. The state will authorize a matching fund of $1.5 million to be released exclusively to a designated third-party operational receiver. I looked directly at my brother. The conditions of this fund are non-negotiable. First, Bradley Vance must immediately resign from his position as Chief Executive Officer, permanently forfeiting all operational authority and executive bonuses. Second, the custom luxury vehicle leases and non-essential corporate overhead must be liquidated within 14 business days. Third, the plant must integrate fully automated inventory arrays and cut its material waste allocation to 4% under state monitoring. If these conditions are rejected, the file is closed, and the plant will enter default. I closed the ledger. This committee is adjourned. The room erupted into an immediate flurry of noise. Reporters stood up to type into their devices, committee analysts gathered their portfolios, and regional applicants moved toward the exits. I didn't rush. I systematically capped my fountain pen, organized my reading glasses into their leather case, and stood up from the head of the table. My spine was perfectly straight, the fabric of my tailored suit smooth and immaculate. As I stepped down from the committee dais and moved toward the private side exit, A voice called out from the edge of the public partition. "Lauren." It was my father. He was standing by the mahogany rail that separated the public gallery from the administrative floor. He looked entirely different than the man who had walked into this chamber at 9:00 a.m. The aggressive, legacy-obsessed industrialist was gone. In his place stood a 62-year-old auto plant owner whose business had just been dismantled by the data he had spent 10 years ignoring. I stopped, turning slowly to face him. I kept 3 feet of administrative space between us. "Mr. Vance, if you have questions regarding the compliance timeline for the restructuring directive, the committee secretary can provide the necessary paperwork." "I don't have questions about the paperwork," he said, his voice low, gravelly, and cracked down the center. He looked at my nameplate on the boardroom table, then back at my face. "Your mother and we watched you up there. We heard the numbers. We saw what you did with the ledger." My mother stepped up beside him, her face tear-streaked, her voice trembling as she reached her hand toward the rail. "Lauren, baby, we truly didn't know what you had built for yourself. The letters you sent. Your father was so focused on Bradley's transition, so angry about the defiance. We didn't open them. If we had known you were doing this. If you had known I would become the chairwoman who held the keys to your survival, you would have signed the Wharton Gap paper." I cut her off, my voice completely level, devoid of volume, but carrying an absolute, freezing clarity. "You aren't apologizing because you realized you crushed a 17-year-old girl's identity at a kitchen table. You are apologizing because the girl you threw away is now the only person in this state who can keep your gates open." My mother flinched, her hand dropping back to her side. My father looked down at his shoes, the drugstore polish dull under the bright corporate lights. He didn't yell. He didn't slam a surface. The silence was doing the work he never could. "The directive gives you a choice, Dad," I said, using his childhood title for the first time, but speaking it with the clinical distance of an auditor. "You can let your pride dissolve the plant entirely, or you can sign the corporate restructuring papers, remove Bradley from leadership, and let the business survive under an objective architecture. I suggested to the board that mercy is the ultimate power move, so I gave you a door. But you will walk through it on my terms, not yours." My father stood frozen for 3 seconds, his jaw working silently. Then he offered a single, devastated nod of his head. "We'll sign," he whispered. "We'll comply with the automation targets." "Good," I said, adjusting the portfolio under my arm. "The secretary will have the documents ready by Monday morning. Excuse me." I turned and walked through the private administrative doors, my heels clicking a sharp, steady rhythm against the floorboards until the sound faded into the quiet of the executive corridor. I didn't look back. I had left them standing at the partition rail, facing the reality of a world they could no longer control. 1 month later, the consequences settled over Savannah like dry concrete. Bradley Vance formally signed his resignation papers on a Wednesday afternoon, relinquishing his title, his executive bonus structure, and the keys to the luxury SUV he had used corporate capital to fund. According to the state monitoring log, he had taken an assistant management position at an independent distribution center 2 counties away, a job where his name carried 0 legacy and his charm didn't affect the monthly inventory audits. He didn't call me. He didn't text. For someone who had built his entire identity on being the chosen heir, the boardroom verdict had been a total structural eviction. My mother and father entered family counseling in February. It was one of the secondary administrative recommendations tucked into the state restructuring contract, a clause that required the family shareholders to undergo governance training to prevent future corporate interference. My mother mailed me a letter 3 weeks into the sessions. It was handwritten on plain cream stationery, the ink slightly shaky. "I spent 20 years telling myself that keeping the peace was the same thing as doing what was right," she wrote. "Every time your father slammed his hand down, every time he decided who mattered and who was invisible, I looked away because it was easier than being brave enough to stand in the doorway and fight for you. I let him slide your future into that shredder, Lauren. I watched the paper turn to dust and I handed him his tea. I can never unsee that machine running, and I will carry that shame for the rest of my life. I don't expect you to open the door for us, but I want you to know that we are finally learning how to look at the ruins. I read the letter at my office desk, sitting in the quiet evening light. I didn't cry. I didn't feel a sudden surge of emotional reconciliation. I simply folded the paper in half, opened the bottom drawer of my desk where I kept Evelyn Vance's original Brunswick Trust documents, and placed it inside. Same drawer, different side. Boundaries aren't built out of anger. They are built out of architecture. You rearrange what you carry so that it no longer weighs down your foundation. Today is June present day, exactly 6 months since the selection committee hearing. The sky over the Capitol is brilliant and clear, the glass windows of the Commerce Building reflecting the deep blue of the afternoon. Vance Manufacturing is still operating. The new state-appointed receiver integrated the automated inventory arrays last month, cutting their material waste allocation down to 3.8%, well under the regional target. The line workers kept their jobs, the debt ratio has stabilized, and the plant is finally running on data instead of entitlement. I'm standing on the front porch of my high-rise apartment, holding a fresh cup of coffee, watching the city traffic move smoothly through the grid below. On the shelf in my living room sits a small, framed photograph, the only one that matters. It's a picture of my grandmother, Evelyn Vance, standing in her Brunswick garden with her shears in hand, looking at the camera with those sharp, knowing eyes that saw through my father's fortress 10 years before it ever cracked. My name is Dr. Lauren Vance. I am 28 years old. I am the chairwoman of the Regional Selection Committee, and I built my life brick by brick, number by number, entirely on my own terms. If you are listening to this and you see yourself in my story, if you are the one standing in the doorway, quiet, underestimated, and waiting for the people who share your DNA to see your worth, I want to tell you something. Stop waiting for them to validate your blueprint. See yourself first. Pack your bags, take the train, find the mentors who choose you, and build a foundation so structurally sound that no one else's prejudice can ever tear it down. And when they finally have to turn around and face you under the lights, let them find a door that you control. You decide when it opens. You decide how wide. You decide who walks through. That is not revenge. That is architecture. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that your worth isn't determined by the people who failed to see it, leave me a comment. Tell me, what would you have done if you held that ledger? Would you have given them the door? And if you want more stories like this, hit subscribe and check the link in the description for one I think you'll love just as much. Until next time, take care of your own foundation. I'll see you then.